Hi, everyone. Welcome to this LinkedIn Live, where we are diving into a topic that's on a lot of minds: how to get ahead in a hybrid workspace. How do you stay visible, when you're not always in the room? Or how do you set boundaries without feeling like you're falling behind? And how do you build strong relationships when your team is spread across locations? And to help us tackle these questions, I'm thrilled to introduce Shawna Samuel with us today. She's the founder and CEO of the Mental Offload, an executive leadership and productivity coach who's dedicated to helping women balance high pressure careers with fulfilling, personal lives. And she has been incredible contributor to Liftery through our Circles program, blogs, and now this LinkedIn Live. So we are so grateful that she's here. So welcome, Shauna, and over to you.
Thank you. Thank you so much, Shivangi. It is such a pleasure to be here. Thank you for inviting me here today to talk about getting ahead in the hybrid workplace, because I think, as you said, this is on the minds of so many people. Many of us are now working hybrid. And that can come with its own unique set of challenges. So you want to stay visible, right? Even when you're not in the office. But there can also be this temptation to overwork and take meetings at all hours because, after all, the laptop is right there in front of you, right? So I think today I'm really, really excited to talk about, won't get to talk about everything, but we're going to get to talk about three of the big challenges that come up around hybrid work: the relationship building, executive presence, and maintaining those good boundaries between work and home life. So, Shivangi, maybe I will start with building relationships, because this is one of the first challenges that I think comes up for people. I know in my own career, I started working hybrid back in 2009. I moved into the international
Wow.
division of my company, and my boss and I were suddenly no longer co-located. So that was my first experience of kind of being a bit hybrid. I was sitting in the office with colleagues. I was not co-located with all of my colleagues or my boss. And then I went on to work in roles in Europe where I had teams across multiple countries. So again, not always co-located, often working asynchronously. And trying to build relationships in those environments is a little bit tricky, because what tends to get lost in the hybrid workplace are those little informal moments where you're actually building that trust and camaraderie or getting things done. That can be really difficult to replicate. I'm not talking here about the sort of like water cooler talk or gossip, right? But sometimes what you're really missing is like the little meeting after the meeting, where you get that really all important feedback about which of your points actually landed and what didn't work so well in your presentation. You also kind of miss that ability to just drop by a colleague's desk and sort out an issue in 10 minutes. Sometimes you type in a Slack message and then you have to wait 12 hours to get a response. So I think it's really important when you're in a hybrid environment to have a very intentional strategy for building your relationships. So I'm going to give everyone two very tactical tips to help do that. The first one: I believe that everyone needs an informal networking plan, and you should target about 2 hours a week for just making informal connections. That might sound like a lot, I think, to some people, Shivangi, but 2 hours, when you think about it, it's like a half-hour coffee meeting each day of the week, or a 2 hour block on a slow day. That informal relationship building plan is super important. And I recommend that you really think about a mix of touch points. Like, this doesn't all have to be virtual Zoom calls where you're on video and having a sort of scheduled meeting. It could also be a really quick post town hall debrief call, for example. In these days where we're all always on text message, it's rare to get a phone call. So if you call someone, they tend to pick up, and you can have a quick chat about what really happened and how things landed. I think also some teams do a pretty effective job of using things like Slack or Teams I worked on a team for a while. We had a really good sort of random channel on Slack where we would just share what was going on randomly or things in the news and use that to build informal bonds. I think one of the best things that you can do as part of that networking plan is make it a priority, make sure that you have one, and leverage a mix of touch points and your personal interests, right? So for some people, this might be sharing restaurant recommendations. For some, it might be sharing really good leadership articles that they found. Whatever is authentic to you, do it, share it. It matters less, I think, how you do it than just like Nike, just do it. Have a plan. Make sure that you're spending about 2 hours a week on that informal relationship building.
I know I definitely need a plan. So thank you for just giving this tip. I think I'm a little miserable at connecting beyond the screen. So I think this is helpful to me.
Oh, great. I'm glad to hear that. I think that's the case for so many of us. We have Zoom fatigue, right? So,
Yeah.
yeah, scheduling yet another Zoom connection call can be a little bit overwhelming. So, I want to remind people there are multiple ways to do this. It just matters that you do it.
So actually, we received a question. We were just asking internally into our network, if they have questions for you. So one of them asked that, so how do you balance staying connected with colleagues without feeling like you're overcompensating or constantly scheduling meetings? So
Yeah. So I think that one of the things, and we'll talk a little bit more about this when we talk about boundaries as well. But one of the things that's really important is that you can recognize that you need to be doing informal networking without letting it overrun your schedule. What I would say is give yourself a meeting budget for these informal meetings and use that to help drive how much of this you're doing. But informal relationship building, let's be clear on what it does not have to mean. So this does not have to mean you're answering every Teams message that comes through within 2 minutes, right? So it doesn't mean you have to be always on some of your connection channels. It also doesn't mean that you need to book a day back to back with Zoom calls and coffee chats in order to make this work. So set yourself a budget, know what you're trying to do, and don't let that sneak over into derailing your schedule, your priorities, your actual agenda. You want this to be part of what you do, not taking over your schedule.
this is needed. I think sometimes we just feel that, I don't know, sometimes we feel left out also if we do not do all these things, but I guess we kind of need boundaries here as well.
Yes, there tends to be a little bit of a race to the bottom with this. If you're working in an environment where everyone seems to be always on all the time, it can
Yeah.
be very difficult to stand apart. But that is part of, especially if you're leading a team, that's part of leadership, is showing how to do this constructively without letting it take over your day or your agenda.
No, I think this is a much needed tip, definitely for me.
Shivangi, were there other questions around relationship building that have come up so far? I know we have comments open as well if people want to type things in. But let me know if there was another question on relationship building, or I will talk a little bit about executive presence. So let's talk a little bit about the second area that sometimes tends to get lost or at least diluted in the hybrid space. This is executive presence. And here's the thing, it is genuinely harder to read the room, influence others when you're showing up on video versus in the room. And I'll talk a little bit about some of the research about that because I think it's important. So post-pandemic, there's been some research on executive presence, and the findings are maybe a little bit unsurprising, but in the hybrid world is even more of a premium sometimes on showing up in person. This can be a little bit difficult to digest if you are mostly remote, or even if you need to show up for some meetings hybrid. So we'll talk about how to make this work in context, but I think it's really important to know. There still is that little bit of bias or edge that goes to the people in the room. And part of that is just because, when you're next to someone, it's a little bit easier to have that informal
Mhm.
conversation and connection. And some of that is because when you're sitting behind the screen, it is a little bit harder to read the room. So, what I want people to really take away from executive presence in the hybrid space is that presence is important. You still need to show executive presence, but it looks a little bit different in the hybrid world. So, good in terms of executive presence, to get really tactical, is to show up to the meeting and contribute, whether you're on video, whether you're dialing in audio only, whether you're in the room. Showing up and contributing, that's good. Even better, this comes from the research. Even better, turning your video on, using clear, confident communication, making sure that you have a strong appearance, and to the extent that you can, trying to tune your communications for both warmth and content. This all kind of tunes up your executive presence, makes it a little bit better, even on video. Now, the best, again, going back to the research, it really is showing up in person. Now, that doesn't mean that you have to be there in person for every meeting, but I kind of remember this anecdote. I think it was maybe Michael Lewis in Liar's Poker, who he was working in an investment bank in New York and said there was this moment, around Thanksgiving in the US, so toward the end of November, where all the London-based investment bankers were suddenly showing up in the New York office, happened to be there for family vacation. What was really going on is that they realized that bonus decisions were made in December. So showing up
Oh.
in person at the end of November to state their case, talk about their accomplishments, and do it in
Mm.
person was a very strategic choice. I also had a client who, she was normally doing drop off of her toddler in the morning, but her chief marketing officer scheduled an 8 a.m. meeting on a very big decision. She made a strategic choice. All right, someone else is handling drop off that day. This is probably one of my biggest meetings of the quarter, and I'm going to do it in person. So I really encourage people to make that choice strategically. Think about, if this is my best option, where and when can I deploy that for most impact? Doesn't mean, again, that working hybrid can't work in terms of executive presence. It still can. Remember, you've got good, better, and best. But I want you to think strategically about when and how you show up so that you can show up with maximum impact.
It's actually interesting research. I mean, and interesting tips, of course. I mean, as somebody who's been working remotely for a very long time now, I don't know, I was just thinking, okay, what were the instances, when I was looking at my bosses and, I was really feeling it, feeling their presence. So, yeah, it could be, I mean, I was just correlating the points there.
And it's interesting, even on Zoom or video, there are some
Mhm.
meetings and formats where you might show up with a more informal, relaxed presence, and some where you're going to show up formally for maximum impact and maximum influence. So I think that you made a great point. Like, sometimes in some meetings, you're just showing up informally, and that's totally okay. It doesn't always have to be as your most formal, presentation driven self.
And again, we received a question around this. So, are there any specific communication habits that help reinforce executive presence when working remotely? I know some of it you mentioned, but just to address this question, if you can.
Yeah. So I'll give a couple of tips that I think are really helpful. I won't cover everything when it comes to showing up. I'll talk specifically about showing up well on video, whether that's
Mm-hmm.
Zoom or Teams. I think rule number one is, no matter what, speak up and make yourself heard, especially if you're showing up on video. I think obviously even more true in the era where you might be dialing in audio only and we didn't have as much video capability. but really speaking up and making yourself heard. If you are attending a meeting, one of your objectives should be to get your point and your point of view across. Just make sure that you do that. Have a plan to do that, even if you're showing up on video. The second thing is video works a little bit differently from being in the room. So I almost think of it as kind of learning a different language or learning a different technology. When you're in the room, if you're presenting, you're probably looking around and making eye contact with different people in the room. Really good way to kind of connect and check in and make sure that your message is being heard. Sounds pretty straightforward, but when you're on video, if you try to make eye contact with everyone on the screen, you can probably see me as I'm doing this now. It kind of looks as if you're unfocused, right?
Yeah.
So instead, we want to be a little more thoughtful and discreet around when we're checking in with people on the screen and when we're making eye contact with the camera. So if this feels a little unnatural, you might even decide to put a picture of your team behind your camera, just so that it really feels like you're looking at people. So that's tip number 2. The third is, now this I want people to be thoughtful about, because in some organizations this is going to be appropriate, in some less so, but you can use the chat function strategically, especially if it's in a less formal meeting. But because people do tend to check the chat, if something turns up, people tend to look at it, you can use the chat function to help make your presence felt. You don't want to do this excessively. You do want to make sure that you are tuning this to the formality level of the meeting. So we aren't going to drop, "Hey, great point," as our CEO is giving a big presentation, right? So we're going to tune this appropriately to our organization, but where it's appropriate, you can also use the chat function to help make your presence felt without having to be constantly raising a hand and saying, "Hey, I've got something to add."
I think this, again, great points.
Thanks. Thank you. I hope this resonates for everyone.
Okay, I think we just had one question here, so we can move forward.
So we're going to talk about everyone's favorite topic, boundaries. Boundaries are so crucial. And so, yes, executive presence, super important, and can be a little bit different when it comes to hybrid work. Same with relationship building. Boundaries are very different when it comes to the hybrid space. Tends to get lost for a lot of people is there can be a lot of pressure to overwork and to overcommit. Try to be visible, to prove that you're valuable. We sometimes mistake being available at all hours for making more impact. And then there's just the proximity issue. If the laptop is sitting right in front of you, it can be really difficult to be like, "No, I can't actually take that meeting." What I want people to remember is that boundaries are actually crucial. More work does not always mean more impact. And in fact, it often means less impact. So let's talk about a couple of really actionable tips that people can start to put into place. First, you need to decide what your boundaries are going to be. Very difficult to hold your boundaries if they're unclear or super fluid. So your boundaries might be in terms of time. They might be in terms of your responsiveness. Like if you get a text message at 9 p.m. from your boss, do you feel compelled to respond or not? So you want to decide your boundaries up front. And I want to remind people that boundaries really start in the mind. Now, what do I mean by that? So do you kind of equate being always available with being valuable? Well, then it's going to be really, really difficult to not respond when that 9 p.m. text message comes through. It's going to be really tough not to get online and do the meeting at 7 p.m. even while you're trying to cook dinner, right? So boundaries start in the mind, in how you think about when you need to be available, what is valuable, what makes impact. So start by thinking about that. And if you notice that you have some, let's say, not so helpful beliefs when it comes to boundaries, it's a really important signal to do that work and to shift some of those beliefs so that you can better hold your boundaries. The second thing that I think is really important is how you communicate those boundaries.
Wow.
So some people work in a very high transparency culture. Like your boss might be like, look, I block every day from 4 to 5 p.m. I do my kids' pickup. I really don't take meetings during that time. That's probably a signal that you are in a high transparency culture and that you can probably be fairly open with your own boundaries in terms of time or in terms of workload. Some of you may be working in a low transparency culture, right? So people don't necessarily say that they're not available at these times or for certain reasons. And if that's the case, you want to just assess what kind of culture you're working in. And be very careful, because if you're working in a low transparency culture, that does not necessarily mean that people have no boundaries. That just may mean that they're discreet about how they communicate them. So you might find that people tend to put things on their calendars as personal appointment or external commitment. And you can do similar things to help establish your own boundaries while still working within the culture that you find yourself. So you can be more subtle, but you can still have boundaries. But I think a key takeaway when it comes to boundaries, and the reason why so many people struggle with them, is both because it does require some enforcement, but also there can really be this mistaken belief that no boundaries indicate great performance and make you more valuable and more of an asset to the team. It's really important to challenge that, because the people who get ahead, especially in the hybrid workplace, they're not necessarily taking on everything and doing everything and working 24/7. They tend to be focused. They're working on high impact stuff, and they're making sure that they knock that out of the park. That requires protecting your stamina, your bandwidth, and your energy, because if you don't, you will probably risk burnout. So boundaries, crucially important, and really can be done, I think, in the hybrid environment.
My God, I think this was really relatable because I learned it the hard way. And I think I was fortunate that my boss was like, she kind of helped me to set boundaries. She was like, no, you don't have to respond to me, at this time. Do it when you're free. So do you do it in your work time? Well, I would be very into, okay, I know now I want to kind of respond to every email at that point. So
Right.
I think
Yes.
kind of learned it the hard way, but yeah, like
I
it's
think for many of us, like we learned it through the school of hard knocks. And when you're lucky, you get a great boss like that who encourages it, who will kind of help you set appropriate boundaries. But especially, if you grew up as a high performer and a go-getter, like you always want to be like, yes, I'm available. Yes, I'll do it. Yes, yes. And learning to say that appropriate, confident no in a way that works within your organization is a game changer.
do have a question from the network. Although half of it was answered, but uh, I still ask. So, setting boundaries is crucial for avoiding burnout, but one usually ends up taking on too much work
Mm.
out of fear of seeming less committed. So, how does one know when to draw the line while staying competitive with their coworkers?
Yeah. Oh, it's such a good question. Right? That person probably speaks for thousands of people, right? Who kind of feel that same fear and pressure. Like, what if I say no to the thing that's going to make me less competitive? So, what I really encourage you to think about is flash forward to your year end review. Your boss is probably unlikely to be like, oh, Shivangi, she's worked on these 120 things, and here's a list of each of them, right? Doing more won't, in and of itself, make you more competitive. It's really doing high impact work that matters. So I really encourage you to kind of flash forward and be strategic. So you want to filter the things that are coming to you through the lens of, is this high enough impact that it's going to merit a mention at your end? And if it is, great. That's probably something you want to try to make room for in your workload. If it's not, it doesn't mean that it's an automatic no or don't do it, but it's absolutely a good candidate for pushing back and having the conversation to manage up, which, by the way, just having that conversation may make you more competitive because you will be showing leadership strategy around your workload and thoughtfulness about what matters to the organization. Those are really good traits to show.
It's a very useful tip. I don't know. I think at this point, I would love to bring in some questions if we have from the audience. If anyone wants to ask anything, they can, and we can take it up towards the end. So, any last thoughts or any thoughts you have at this point?
Yeah, so just to really tie a bow on this subject, I know we haven't covered everything that matters when it comes to the hybrid workplace, but I really think that these three things are incredibly important and probably some of the biggest challenges that we face if you've traditionally worked in office most of the time. Doing hybrid work requires some real thoughtful tweaks in terms of your relationship building strategy. So go and do that informal networking plan and think about making sure you're spending at least 2 hours a week on that. Then there's the executive presence piece. Be strategic about when you show up in person and know that there are things that you can concretely do to show more presence even over video. So invest in learning that as if it's your new language that you need to learn. And then of course there's boundaries, which are so important for your stamina, for your productivity, and for your well-being, right? We all need that in order to function at our best at work. So please be thoughtful about some of those beliefs around being always available, always taking on everything. Some of those can really get in our way of showing up to do our highest impact, best work. So I think if people keep those three things in mind, they will already be miles ahead when it comes to succeeding in the hybrid workplace and hopefully feel more confident and better about their work as well, even when they're not always in the same room as others.
So, thank you, Shauna. So, with this, we come to an end. This has been such an insightful conversation. So, thank you again, Shauna, for sharing your expertise. And also, a huge thank you to everyone who joined us today. So, keep the conversation going on in the comments, and we'll see you next time.
Thank you so much for having me, Shivangi. This was a pleasure, and I appreciate the great questions and the interest in this topic.
We loved having you, and let's see what we bring in next time.
Wonderful.
Okay.
I look
Thank you.
forward to connecting with all of you on LinkedIn.